It is not uncommon at a Jewish funeral of a great Jewish leader for it to be spoken, may his death serve as an atonement for our generation. May God consider his righteousness and his merit. This would be the traditional understanding. So his death, as he's taken from us, may that procure healing and atonement for our generation. Here's another midrash. The Messiah, in order to atone for them both, meaning Adam and David, will make his soul a trespass offering. As it is written, quoting from Isaiah 52 and 53, that the servant of the Lord will be an asham, a trespass offering, which then with numeric interpretation comes out to equal a name of the Messiah. Let me read one more quote and then try to back you into this and give you an understanding of how this concept arose. This is rabbinic scholar Solomon Schechter, writing many years ago. This is his summary of the Talmudic teaching that suffering and death atone for sin, with specific reference to the death of the righteous. I know we believe in this concept as it applies to the Messiah. I want to try to give you an understanding of where it comes from, how it develops. So the atonement of suffering and death, he says, is not limited to the suffering person. The atoning effect extends to all the generation. This is especially the case with such sufferers as cannot either by reason of their righteous life or by their youth possibly have merited the afflictions which have come upon them. So either they're too young or they seem to be too righteous to have suffered these things. Why are they suffering this? Somehow their suffering is bringing atonement and healing to others. The death of the righteous atones just as well as certain sacrifices. Quote, they are caught, suffer for the sins of the generation. If there are no righteous, the children of the schools, that is, the innocent young children, are caught for the sons of the generation. Quoting from the Talmud, Shabbat 32b. There are also applied to Moses the scriptural words, and he bore the sins of many, Isaiah 53. Because of his offering himself as an atonement for Israel's sin with the golden calf, being ready to sacrifice his very soul for Israel when he said, if not, blot me, I pray, out of thy book, that is, from the book of the living which thou hast written. Schechter says this readiness to sacrifice oneself for Israel is characteristic of all the great men of Israel, the patriarchs and the prophets acting in the same way, whilst also some rabbis would on certain occasions exclaim, behold, I am the atonement of Israel. What does that mean? How did they come to this notion? In the Maccabean War, celebrated with Hanukkah, the Jewish defeat of the Greeks, the 2nd century before Yeshua. There are books that recount those events, the books of the Maccabees. And there were Jews that were killed fighting for freedom, fighting for Torah, fighting for loyalty to God at that time. And by giving themselves in battle against all odds, they were willingly laying themselves down. They were laying down their lives. They were, in that sense, righteous martyrs. Now look at this. Look at this. From 4th Maccabees. According to 4th Maccabees, it is written that these righteous warriors prayed this prayer, cause our chastisement to be an expiation for them. Make my blood their purification and take my soul as a ransom for their souls. Where does this idea come from? This is while the temple was standing. There was a battle for the purity of the temple and righteous sacrifices to be offered. But they're not even thinking in place of the temple here. This is at this point a parallel concept. What do they mean by it? Of these righteous martyrs, it's recorded in 4th Maccabees 17:22. Again, all the references here in the text. They have become as a ransom for the sin of our nation, and by the blood of these righteous men and the propitiation of their death, divine providence delivered Israel. And where does this tradition of righteous martyrdom date back to? According to Jewish tradition, it went back to the binding of Isaac. Again, quoting from 4th Maccabees. When Abraham was ready to offer his own son as a sacrifice to God, 4th Maccabees states, Isaac offered himself for the sake of righteousness. Isaac did not shrink when he saw the knife lifted against him by his father's hand. According to rabbinic tradition, Isaac was 37 years old when Abraham went in Genesis 22 to sacrifice him on Mount Moriah. Obviously very different than the way most folks would read it and see him as a boy. Rabbinic tradition has him as 37. In fact, rabbinic tradition explains the fact that his eyesight failed later in his life based on the revelation of the angel there on Mount Moriah, that it was blinding to him. So as a 37-year-old, he is now willingly laying down his life. He is righteous, and yet he is willing to die in obedience to the command of God. So the biblical tradition puts its great emphasis on the obedience of Abraham. Rabbinic tradition also puts great emphasis on the obedience of Isaac. You say, but Isaac didn't die. Yes, but the later traditions accounted it as if he did die. So rabbinic tradition says, when God was asked by angels, what's so significant about man? God says, you shall see a father slay his son, and the son consenting to be slain to sanctify my name. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In fact, this rabbinic tradition, this midrash, compares Isaac, who carried on his shoulder the wood for the burnt offering, to one who carries his cross on his own shoulder. Now, they weren't painting a picture between him and Jesus, but they're making the comparison of someone willingly going to their own death, taking the instrument of death on your shoulders. So, although Isaac was not sacrificed, the rabbis taught, quote, Scripture credits Isaac with having died and his ashes having lain upon the altar. Another rabbinic quote, God regards the ashes of Isaac as though they were piled upon the altar. There are even rabbinic traditions that say that when God says, when I see the blood, I'll pass over you, he's ultimately talking about the blood of Isaac. And that when sacrifices were offered in the temple, that God thought back to the blood of Isaac. Another rabbinic midrash, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Moses, I keep faith to pay the reward of Isaac, son of Abraham, who gave 1/4 of his blood on the altar. Geza Vermesh, one of the top Dead Sea Scrolls scholars in the world, scholar of early Jewish literature, professor at Oxford. Vermesh states that according to the ancient Jewish theology, the atoning efficacy of the Tamid offering, the fixed daily offering, of all the sacrifices in which a lamb was immolated, and perhaps basically of all expiatory sacrifice, irrespective of the nature of the victim, depended upon the virtue of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, the self-offering of that lamb whom God had recognized as the perfect victim of the perfect burnt offering. So in other words, when God accepted later sacrifices and offerings, he did it based on the merit of righteous Isaac, who shed his blood willingly on the altar. Of course, the only hitch there is that he didn't shed his blood. He didn't die. I was teaching this years ago to some Messianic Jewish leaders in Maryland. And when we got through all of the texts, one of my friends who was a Messianic pastor said, boy, I can almost